do get more time with children, less economic instability, less volatility, more gender egalitarian divisions of labor. I'm not a total policy determinist. There are lots of things at hand there. We know very much about what policies can help people to reach the aspirations that they state in Kathleen's book. And more importantly, we know that the U.S. is off the charts as an outlier in terms of work-family reconciliation policy, more than any other social policy area. I can tell you 1,000 reasons why it's almost impossible for young couples to share and share alike. We know that, so why don't they know that? So I wrote here, tell them, Kathleen, tell them. 120 of them, get them over here, and Carol and I will talk to them. But second of all, and I'm sure many of you. Second of all, to be honest, I was also surprised. It goes against the grain of a lot of polling data. When I wrote my book, and some years ago now, of course, these would have been mostly from the late 90s and early 2000s, I surveyed a lot of literature on polls. And the U.S. polls were really quite consistent. The majority of Americans, and often a substantial majority, support, quote, say they support, more government involvement in paid leave, in child care, in the regulation of working time. They want longer school days, longer school years, et cetera. So this reminds me of, I was just have to say, I was watching The Daily Show the other night, and he had his favorite subject, Glenn Beck, on, talking about how government ruins everything. And how does he know? Because he's self-educated, because I went to the library, he said. I went to the library, and I educated he went to the public library, right. Where you can check books out, and then he says with a big smile, and they're free. Okay, so the point is, why don't they see that private change will never bring about these changes? Voluntary employer changes won't either. So coming back to the polls, though, why the discrepancy? Is it a methodological discrepancy? Polling is different from qualitative interviewing. Is it that the times have changed? These are the children, they're the Obama generation, but they're the children of Ronald Reagan.
They're the Reagan generation.
They are the Ronald Reagan children, and they have lived through 30 years of conservative anti-government sentiment,
yes, exactly.
Where these polls were done only after 20. So I want to ask, did another decade of conservatism wear away the last vestiges of American support for public policy? And then finally, just to say, why are they so pessimistic? I guess I would close with that. They're calling to explain. I think that.
Here they are.
So the question is really, why don't they know that the U.S. is off the charts? That there is another way? Why are they so pessimistic? Is it because they're the Ronald Reagan children, and they've only become the Obama children?
Well, yes, remember that. The Obama represents a hope, but not their experience.
Right, right.
So I'd like to say so I was in a role as moderator and said very little about my own reactions. Let me take 2 minutes to say two things about why these issues might be very important. And so I will slip into my social demographer mode. One is that, and I think this speaks to a bit of Carol's point. One is that as stylized facts go, as of today, about 2 in 5 children are born outside of formal marriage. And if one thinks about a retreat from caring, that is an enormous retreat from caring. That on average, men are abdicating from these families. And I think that's a very important social trend to be thought of in relation to the increasing assertions of egalitarianism. That's one. A second is that not in the United States particularly, but in much of the advanced industrialized world, fertility rates are plummeting, and they are plummeting to below replacement levels. So that 20 years ago, demographers would talk about Italy, Spain, and Japan as having rapidly aging, rapidly declining populations. These days, the list is something like 25. And I would argue, and I think Kathleen would agree, that we now add to the list Taiwan, South Korea, most of the former Soviet bloc countries, and just coincidentally, I think Kathleen would agree with this observation, where gender roles appear to be most rigid, women are opting out of having kids.
Absolutely.
And
Surprise, surprise.
You're jumping to my conclusions.
South Korea and Japan at 1.2, 1.3 kids on average per woman implies something like having a population size in about 55 years. Think about that. Kathleen.
Yikes. Whew, this was fabulous. How am I going to have time to even organize this, much less respond to all of it?
And you have 10 minutes.
Can you hear me? Well, first, I just want to thank, I don't even know where to begin, in thanking everyone who has worked so hard to pull this event together, to put your time, and not just your time, but your really deeply insightful thoughts into all of this. To all of you who are here on this snowy day, to my wonderful support group at Oxford, I don't know if they're here or not, but they've been fabulous. And to my own family, whom I'm often embarrassed to call on as support because women aren't supposed to do that, right? But I've had the experience of growing up in a single parent home with a very strong and amazing mother who made me always feel as if I had everything anyone else could need, and to live in an extraordinarily egalitarian home, not without its struggles, and which I think our child is very happy to have had that experience growing up. So that said, let me just try to say briefly, all of these responses are so profound and so worthy of spending a lot of time on, but so is the food and the drink and the celebration. So I will try and make this as fast as possible. A couple of things I just want to stress about my own argument that I think have come through, but I want to make it clear. I really argue that from the experience of the people who live it, as opposed to the demographers and the psychologists and the sociologists who go out and measure it from the outside, that family life itself is experienced as a film, not a snapshot. That it is an ongoing process, and therefore our views of it change, and very much as Dalton was pointing out, we don't all live in the same families just because we happen to live in the same household. And I think we really need to take that seriously. My dream study someday would be to follow the experiences and trajectories of people who grow up in the same homes, because I think that gives us such a clear view that our notions of psychological determinism, or family determinism, which is, I think, the sort of the more conservative view, that it's only a certain kind of family that will produce a certain kind of outcome. And it's by looking at how, in fact, similar families, people move in very different directions, and people from very different families move in similar ones, is a profound way of getting at that. Not just because they have different experiences within the home, but because, as Dalton has pointed out in his work, they have different accesses to resources and opportunities outside the home. And back to the notion of where institutions fit in, families are not villages. And the only way to make sure that in a world, the post-industrial world that I talk about in my book, is not a world of simple, predictable steps through the life cycle. It's an increasingly uncertain world, both in terms of our personal relationships, for which we have very high standards, but face all kinds of barriers in achieving those standards, and also in the economic world, where jobs and careers are getting rearranged in a way that there really is no longer some simple, straightforward male path through adulthood. And so in some ways, we don't have a choice. The basic economic, social, and demographic forces that are taking place in the 21st century will force us to change. The question is, the choices that we have as individuals and as a society, is what kind of life will they have? What kind of institutions can we create that make those paths better, rather than worse. This gets to my second point. When it comes to how family life unfolded, there is a part of me that is an optimist. I'm always looking for how we can overcome the basic human struggles that all societies and all human beings face. But that doesn't mean we are hopeless and doomed as a result of them. What I found was that the young men and women who grew up in these changing times, the fate of their families and the fate of their own sense of well-being depended on how well their parents, their mothers, their fathers, the communities they lived in, the networks that they either could call on and could not, responded in a flexible way to the predictably unpredictable crises of modern industrial society. Crises, economic crises, through job changes and losses, interpersonal crises as people struggle to try and create the relationships they want and then fail and then have to try again or fall apart and go somewhere else. And I want to really underline, it wasn't just flexibility in some abstract way. It's gender flexibility that's crucial. And this is what I think has been missing from our discussion of family life in America. We really, and the implication has always been that somehow the well-being of children, the well-being of society, and the well-being of families requires inequality in the home. What Carol would call patriarchy. It's a word I avoid simply because the trouble with patriarchy is you have to ask the question, are you using it as an explanation or are you using it as something that you're trying to explain? So I just try to get beneath that word to look at what actually we mean by gender inequality. And what I find is that it was gender flexibility, the ability for men to transgress those boundaries that hold them to this good provider ethic and relieve them of the care work, the ability of women to overcome the confinement that they felt, to go out and to care for their families, even whether they were married or not. But when they were not married, it was especially important. And to see that kind of development of the self in the public world as a form of care and love for their children. And we have to stop dichotomizing these. And I guarantee you that the men and women I talked to did not see work as a form of neglect. They saw it as a form of care. Similarly, care was not seen as a way of not living up to your responsibilities and outside. It was seen as a way of saying, you matter more than that does. I see, why aren't they fighting? Because, to put it, they may not, what did someone say about downhill skiers? We may be crazy, but we're not stupid. I agree with you that I wish that we lived in a society where people could believe that the things they fought for would be achieved. It's not that they don't want these supports, but they're also fearful, first, that all these efforts to create these supports will come to naught, and that in the public sphere of government and politics, where so much of our debate has remained stalemated, we're still arguing about whether or not these changes are good or bad. How can we possibly begin to get to the point where we accept the fact that they're inevitable and that we have to rearrange our work and community and child rearing and family institutions to face them? Well, I think in that context, of course, you're going to want to try and figure out how you can survive in the actual world you live in, as opposed to the world that you wish existed. From the point of view of employers, and this I think is even more depressing, the fear is that the sort of profit motive of modern workplaces, coupled with the lack of loyalty to employers, means that whatever they give you will come back to haunt you. And many studies show this, that men and women alike want family-friendly policies, they want flexible work, but they know if they take it, they'll be penalized for it, because we define the ideal worker in an impossible way. It's at odds with the way that we define the ideal parent, or certainly the ideal mother. So I think our challenge is to, we have to fight this together. Let me add one more cleavage that needs to be overcome. There are all kinds of debates about about differences among, not just among men and women, but among ethnic groups, class groups, that the kinds of processes that are occurring are actually increasing class inequality, as Dalton pointed out, and racial divisions. And what I found heartening in this research was how that it's at some basic level of culture, the forces of change have brought us to a point where there's a great deal of shared vision about what a good society would look like and what living a good life would look like. The divisions are there because our institutions make it so difficult to achieve that. And yes, people bring different resources to coping with dilemmas that are socially structured but have no institutionalized ways of dealing with them. So, let me just, before I move on to where I think we should go next, let me just see if I've responded as best I can to at least some of these wonderful comments that people have made.
So Kathleen, we are almost at the end of
Okay, good. Then let me go.
Let's let people
Yes.
ask questions.
Yeah. I do want to say one thing, Larry, which is, and this is apropos of Janet's comments, and that is, where do I think we go from here? And that's all I want to say. I don't think we have any choice. I call it the unfinished revolution because, well, life is unfinished. Societies are unfinished. There's never some end point. But in this case, we are at a critical historical moment. A moment in which the past is simply no longer possible to retrieve for demographic and economic reasons, regardless of the nostalgic or politically motivated groups that would oppose that. If you look at the views, the voting patterns of younger cohorts, they see this. Not one person I talked to said they wanted to go back to the way things were. But we don't have to stay where we are. The real question is, where do we go from here? That's what I want to do next. I want to find out how these dilemmas, these contradictions are being worked out in a changing social landscape of care and work, and whether or not in doing so we can overcome these cleavages or not. And the final thing I would add is exactly what Janet pointed to, is to think about how all of these strategies are embedded in a particular set of American cultural, institutional, and policy approaches, which are individualistic as much as patriarchal. It's that we believe in equal opportunity, but every person is on their own. And what that has produced, as I say, is individual efforts to find some individual solution. I think it'd be very interesting to compare how these strategies are being worked out in other social and policy contexts in which the starting premise is a collective responsibility for care, and therefore a completely different context in which men and women can work out these frameworks. And to compare that with, as Larry pointed out, the places where there's the naive belief that by simply promoting some more traditional form, however limited that family form is in time and space, that somehow trying to recreate that will work, because those are the societies that are in the greatest crisis. What you find, and why interviewing is so important to me, is you find time and time again that human beings are not automatons. They respond in unanticipated ways to the social policies, the social institutions, and the social conditions that try to thwart them. And the political optimist in me is that it won't do us much good wringing our hands and tearing out our hair about how bad things are. I think the job is to try to create the world in which we want ourselves, our children, and their children to live in.